From the outside, my life looked perfect. Everything anyone could ever dream of. A $5.8 million estate, 2 beautiful children, and a future I thought was secure. I moved through my days believing I was protected, loved, and surrounded by people who would never betray me. But life has a way of revealing truths at the exact moment you're least prepared for them. My name is Amelia Hartwell, and the day the court ruling came down, my entire world collapsed. My home was taken from me. My children were taken from me. And worst of all, lies were believed over the truth I no longer had the strength, or the evidence, to defend. I walked out of that courtroom broken, carrying nothing but the weight of everything I'd lost. But destiny has its own timing. Hidden deep in an old wooden chest, buried beneath years of dust, was an envelope, forgotten by everyone except the man who left it there for me. Inside it was a truth powerful enough to shake every lie that destroyed my life, and strong enough to rebuild everything I thought was gone forever. This is my story, how I lost everything, and how one forgotten envelope gave me the power to take it all back. I still remember the sound of the gavel echoing through the courtroom, a sharp, merciless crack that sliced through my chest like a blade. I had stood there frozen, unable to breathe, unable to even blink, as the judge announced that custody of my children would be granted to my ex-partner. The words felt unreal, as if someone had reached into my life and rewritten the script without warning. But what destroyed me completely was the announcement that followed. The $5.8 million estate, the home I had worked my entire life to build, would no longer belong to me. Even now, thinking about it makes my throat tighten and my hands tremble, because that moment was not just a legal defeat. It was the day everything I loved was stripped away in front of strangers. As I stood there trembling, the courtroom spinning around me, I wished someone would reach out and tell me it wasn't real. But it was. And before I continue my story, please subscribe, follow, or stay with me until the end, because what happened next changed my life in ways I never expected, and it may very well change how you see trust, betrayal, and justice forever. The judge's voice kept drifting in and out, swallowed by the thunderous pounding of my heart. I watched my ex-partner sitting confidently beside their lawyer, lips curled in satisfaction, as if this courtroom were a stage and they were performing their grand finale. Their new partner sat behind them, smirking at me like victory was a perfume they were already wearing. I felt naked, exposed, humiliated. Everything presented against me, messages, documents, accusations, had seemed so detailed, so calculated, almost too perfectly constructed to be real. And yet the judge believed every bit of it. I tried to speak. I tried to defend myself. I tried to tell the court that half of the evidence was fabricated, twisted, or taken out of context. But fighting back felt like yelling into a storm, my voice disappearing before it reached anyone. My lawyer, exhausted and confused, whispered, "We don't have enough counter-evidence." It felt like betrayal from every direction. How had my ex known all my financial records, private messages, and personal conversations? How had they accessed things I never shared with anyone? Those questions burned in the back of my mind, unanswered and terrifying. By the time the hearing ended, I felt like I was watching my life from outside my own body. People moved around me, shaking hands, packing bags, whispering gossip while I stood frozen in place, my feet glued to the floor. My ex brushed past me, their perfume sharp and victorious, and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "You should have seen this coming." I wanted to argue, to scream, to demand the truth, but my voice had abandoned me. I simply watched them walk out with the confidence of someone who had orchestrated the entire outcome. Leaving the courthouse felt worse than staying. The sky outside was painfully bright, sunlight stabbing my eyes like needles. Reporters lingered near the steps, pointing cameras, waiting for reactions, eager for drama. I pulled my coat tighter around my body and avoided their questions, stumbling toward the parking lot like a wounded animal. My phone buzzed nonstop. Missed calls, messages, notifications, but I couldn't bear to look. I knew the news had already spread. I knew people were already talking. And I knew some of them would believe every lie told about me because it was easier than believing I was innocent. I got into my car and closed the door, letting the silence swallow me whole. My hands shook uncontrollably as I gripped the steering wheel, my breath shallow and uneven. I stared ahead, watching the world blur through my tears. Memories of my children flooded my mind. Morning routines, laughter echoing through the halls, little footsteps racing down the grand staircase of the estate I once proudly called home. Now all of it belonged to someone else. Someone who had lied, manipulated, and turned my own children against me with stories crafted to tear me apart. The drive back to my small rented apartment felt endless. Every red light felt like another reminder of how powerless I had become. Cars passed me, people walked the sidewalks, the world continued spinning as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed for me. I kept replaying the trial, searching for what I missed. When did the ex begin plotting? Who helped them? How did they gather so much damaging information? Each question only deepened the pit in my stomach, a sinking realization that someone close to me might have betrayed me. When I finally reached the apartment complex, it felt like stepping into a different version of my life. One stripped of luxury, stability, and comfort. The hallway smelled of old paint and broken air conditioners, a stark contrast to the polished marble floors I once walked on. As I unlocked the door, a wave of emptiness washed over me. The tiny living room, sparsely furnished with items I'd been able to salvage, felt more like a temporary shelter than a home. I sat on the couch, staring at the peeling wall, too numb to cry, too devastated to move. Hours passed without me realizing. The silence around me grew heavier, pressing against my chest until it became hard to breathe. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me to my feet, guiding me to the bedroom. That's when I saw the box, an old, forgotten wooden chest sitting in the corner, something I had barely noticed since moving in. It had belonged to my late grandfather, a man who always saw through people in ways I never could. Back then, I had brushed off his warnings about my ex. Now, staring at the dusty box, a seed of curiosity bloomed inside me. I reached for the box, my fingers tracing the worn edges. It felt heavier than I remembered. The metal latch was rusted shut, refusing to budge no matter how hard I tugged. The frustration building inside me matched the desperation pounding in my chest. Something about the box felt important, urgent even, but I couldn't open it. Not yet. My mind was too clouded with grief and exhaustion to think straight. I pushed it aside, promising myself I would try again tomorrow. Little did I know, everything inside that dusty chest would soon turn my world upside down again. I crawled into bed, staring at the ceiling long after midnight. My thoughts raced in circles. My children, the estate, the fabricated evidence, the smug look on my ex's face. Sleep felt impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the judge, the courtroom, the victory that wasn't mine. But somewhere inside me, beneath the heartbreak and the fear, a faint ember of determination flickered. Something wasn't right. Something wasn't adding up. And somehow I sensed the answers lay hidden not in the courtroom, not in my memories, but in that old wooden box. The morning after the verdict felt like waking up inside a storm that had not yet passed. My body refused to move at first, anchored by the weight of grief that sat on my chest like something alive. Every corner of my small apartment reminded me of how far I had fallen, from elegant hallways lined with polished marble to these narrow, cracked walls that echoed with a hollow quiet. My mind kept replaying my children's faces, their eyes filled with confusion and sadness as they walked out of the courtroom with my ex. That image pierced through me like a blade, leaving me raw and breathless. I forced myself to sit up, though the air itself felt heavier than usual, pressing down on me with every breath. The sunlight that leaked through the blinds was pale and weak, barely illuminating the room, yet somehow it managed to highlight the dusty wooden chest in the corner. It sat there like an unanswered question, one that grew louder the longer I stared at it. I hadn't thought much about it when I first moved in, but after everything that had happened in court, it suddenly felt like a relic calling my name, urging me to remember something important. I approached the chest cautiously as if it were capable of speaking. My fingers brushed over the rough wood, tracing the imperfections left behind by time. The latch resisted my touch, rusty and stubborn, refusing to open no matter how firmly I pulled. Something about that resistance ignited frustration in me, not just at the box but at the entire situation I found myself trapped in. It mirrored my life too perfectly. Answers locked behind barriers I couldn't break, truth hidden behind lies I couldn't prove wrong. I sank onto the floor beside it, feeling small, fragile, and overwhelmed by the storm in my chest. My grandfather had been a man of quiet wisdom, someone who observed more than he spoke. Growing up, he used to tell me that every problem carried its own hidden doorway, but you had to be willing to search for it. As I stared at the locked chest, his words echoed in my mind like a whisper carried across time. If he left this behind for me, he must have known I would face a moment like this. Broken, defeated, yet standing at the edge of something deeper. But without the key, the chest remained as silent and closed as the people who had testified against me. I searched through the apartment for the key, though part of me felt foolish for hoping it might magically appear. Cabinets, drawers, boxes, old bags, inside coat pockets I hadn't touched in years. I tore through everything, scattering belongings across the floor in my desperation. But the key remained hidden, as elusive as the truth that had been twisted against me during the trial. With each passing minute, frustration turned into a strange sort of determination, and that determination slowly began to push back against the hopelessness that had swallowed me whole since the verdict. My thoughts drifted back to the courtroom, to the moments where everything fell apart. It wasn't just the loss. It was the certainty with which my ex presented every piece of evidence. The confidence. The precision. The way their lawyer had looked at me, almost smug, as if they knew I didn't stand a chance. Something about it all felt rehearsed, orchestrated. Too perfect. And that perfection gnawed at me now, whispering that none of it had been accidental. Someone had helped them. Someone had fed them information. Private information only people close to me would know. The realization made my stomach tighten. I started replaying conversations in my mind, moments I had shared with people I trusted. A friend who always seemed curious about my finances, a relative who had become strangely distant before the trial, a coworker who knew more about my relationship than they should have. Any one of them could have handed over the details. The betrayal stung even more deeply because I had always believed loyalty was something sacred. But just like the forged evidence that took my children, loyalty could be faked too, twisted into a weapon by the wrong hands. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the mess I had created during my search, feeling both exhausted and strangely alert. My eyes kept drifting back to the chest, and with each glance I felt more certain that the key wasn't missing. It was simply hidden somewhere I hadn't thought to look yet. My grandfather loved symbolism. He never left anything without a clue. With that in mind, I stood and walked toward the small closet at the end of the hallway, the one I barely opened because it was filled with old coats and boxes from my previous home. Digging into the closet felt like digging into another life. I pulled out jackets I hadn't worn since winters in the estate, when the fireplace burned brightly and my children curled up next to me for bedtime stories. The memories were painful, yet I forced myself to keep searching. Eventually, my fingers brushed against something small and metallic inside the lining of an old coat, something that clicked softly when I shook it. My heart skipped as I reached in and pulled out a tiny, tarnished key, almost invisible against my palm. My grandfather had hidden it where only time and desperation would force me to look. I returned to the chest with the key clenched tightly in my hand, my pulse quickening with equal parts fear and anticipation. Kneeling before it, I took a slow breath before slipping the key into the rusted lock. For a moment, it resisted as if testing my resolve. Then with a soft click, the latch gave way. I felt something shift inside me, like a door opening in my mind as well. Carefully, I lifted the lid, expecting perhaps letters or old photographs. But what greeted me inside was something far more startling. Documents bound with a faded ribbon, envelopes marked with dates, and a small USB drive resting on top like a silent witness. My hands trembled as I reached for the documents, the paper brittle under my fingers. They were bank statements, old ones yet strangely familiar. As I read through them, my heart pounded harder with each line. These weren't my accounts. They were accounts connected to my ex. Hidden accounts, secret transactions, unexplained deposits. My grandfather had been tracking them. How? Why? Beneath the statements lay a stack of typed reports from a private investigator, detailing patterns of manipulation, dishonesty, and suspicious behavior that stretched back years. I felt dizzy. My ex's betrayal hadn't started during the divorce. It had begun long before. As I lifted the final envelope marked only with my name, I hesitated. My grandfather's handwriting danced across the paper, steady and deliberate, as if he had known exactly when I would need to read his words. Inside was a message that made my breath hitch in my throat. If you are opening this, it means your heart has been broken in ways you never deserved. But remember, truth does not hide forever. When everything collapses, look closely. You will find what they never wanted you to see. In that moment, the crushing weight on my chest began to shift, transforming into something sharper, stronger, hope mixed with fury. I sat there for a long moment, gripping my grandfather's letter as though it were a lifeline, the words etched into the page pulsing through my mind like a heartbeat I had forgotten existed. My hands still trembled from the shock of what I had discovered, yet beneath the tremor was a growing sense of clarity, slow but undeniable. The lies that had destroyed my life, the evidence that had torn my children from me, had not come out of thin air. My ex had laid the traps carefully, but my grandfather, long before he passed, had apparently seen the storm coming and prepared something to counter it. My eyes drifted back to the chest, now open before me like a doorway into a truth I never expected to find. The documents inside weren't just random pieces of paper, they were threads connecting to something much larger. Hidden bank accounts. Transfers timed suspiciously close to major arguments during my marriage. Payments to names I didn't recognize. My breath hitched with every page I turned, each one revealing that the version of my life I believed in had cracks forming long before everything collapsed. It was terrifying to realize how much happened behind my back, and even more terrifying to acknowledge how blind I had been to the warning signs. Then my gaze landed on the small dusty envelope beneath the stack, its edges yellowed and delicate as though it had survived decades waiting for this moment. The words, "Open only when you have lost everything," were written in my grandfather's familiar cursive, the same style he used when writing birthday letters or signing holiday cards. For a moment I hesitated, afraid of what the envelope might contain. The chest had already changed the way I saw my past. What if the envelope changed the way I saw my future? But my grandfather never frightened me. He protected me even when I didn't know I needed protection. With a slow breath I opened the envelope. Inside were photographs, folded documents, and a smaller slip of paper that made my heart stop. The photographs were old but distinct. Images of my ex meeting someone in dimly lit places, exchanging envelopes, shaking hands with people I had never seen before. The timestamps ran back years before our separation. These weren't casual meetings or coincidences. They were patterns. Patterns of planning, scheming, preparing. My grandfather had somehow noticed behaviors I ignored, documenting every suspicious encounter with the precision of someone who knew the truth would matter one day. Under the photographs was a detailed report from the private investigator my grandfather had hired, a name I vaguely remembered from childhood, a quiet man who spent most of his time observing everything around him. His report was thorough, unsettlingly so. It described how my ex cultivated connections that weren't part of their professional or social circles, how they frequently disappeared for hours during the early years of our marriage, and how they paid large sums of money for data, phone records, and personal information about people close to me. Reading it felt like peeling open wounds I didn't know existed. But it was the final section of the report that shook me the most. It highlighted conversations my ex had with someone listed only as Source C. Someone who provided personal details, private statements, and sensitive financial information that had later appeared almost identically in court. The realization hit me so hard I almost dropped the papers. Someone I trusted had given my ex the ammunition needed to destroy me. Someone from my inner circle had sold me out. My shoulders stiffened as I tried to make sense of who it could be and why they would betray me so completely. I set the documents aside, my pulse thundering as I reached for the small USB drive I had noticed earlier. It seemed simple, almost unremarkable, but part of me sensed that whatever it contained would be more powerful than any printed report. I plugged it into my old laptop, unsure of what I was about to hear or see. A single folder appeared, labeled with my grandfather's initials, and inside it were multiple audio files. My stomach twisted as I clicked on the first one. The sound of voices filled the room, familiar voices. My ex's and another I couldn't identify immediately. The conversation was calm at first, almost casual, but the content was anything but. They discussed strategies, manipulation, and how to create a narrative strong enough to win a custody battle. They talked about forging messages and twisting harmless conversations into evidence of instability. They talked about planting doubts in the children's minds. They even mentioned hiring someone to clean up the documents, to make everything look legitimate. I felt sick. Every lie that had destroyed my life had been conceived long before I ever realized my marriage was falling apart. But the most horrifying moment came when the second voice finally became clear. It belonged not to a stranger but to someone I had trusted deeply, someone I had confided in during the hardest parts of my marriage. Their voice was steady, calm, and disturbingly comfortable as they revealed private details about me, including conversations I never thought would leave the safety of friendship. Hearing that betrayal with my own ears was worse than any court ruling. It shattered a part of me I didn't even know was fragile. I paused the recording, pressing my palms against my eyes as if that would stop the pain. I sat in silence for several minutes, trying to breathe, trying to steady my shaking hands. My entire world had tilted in a single moment, the foundation of trust one once lived by now reduced to rubble. Yet amidst the heartbreak, something else stirred. A fierce determination I hadn't felt in weeks. My grandfather hadn't just given me these files to learn the truth. He wanted me to fight. He wanted me to use the truth the way my ex had used lies. The dusty envelope was not just a warning. It was a weapon, one forged from foresight and love. I picked up the letter again, reading the final lines written in my grandfather's firm hand. When you feel you have lost everything, look closer. What feels like the end is often the beginning of something stronger. You were not meant to break, you were meant to rise. Those words seeped into the cracks in my heart, filling them with something fierce and unyielding. I wiped my tears, my breath steadying as the weight of the evidence settled into focus. My ex had built an empire of lies, but I now held the tools to bring it crashing down. As I closed the chest gently, my fingers lingered on the lid, tracing the wood that had guarded these secrets for so long. I didn't feel defeated anymore. I didn't feel powerless. I felt awakened. For the first time since losing the case, I saw a path, one paved not with fear but with truth. The fight ahead would not be easy, but I was no longer walking blind. I had the recordings. I had the photographs. I had the documents. And with every piece of evidence, I felt myself inching closer to reclaiming what had been stolen from me. My children, my home, and my dignity. The morning of the hearing arrived with a heaviness that settled deep in my bones. I barely slept, not because of fear but because every piece of evidence I had uncovered replayed relentlessly in my mind, reminding me that this wasn't just about the estate. It was about the truth I had been denied for far too long. As I dressed, my hands trembled slightly, though not from weakness. It was anticipation, the kind that comes when you know your life is about to divide into before and after. I looked at myself in the mirror, saw the exhaustion, the sharpness of new resolve, and whispered, "This time I walk in with the truth by my side." And for the first time since losing everything, I felt ready. I arrived at the courthouse early, my folder of documents tucked tightly under my arm like a shield. The building looked different from the last time I saw it. Maybe it was my perspective, or maybe it was simply that I was no longer walking in as the woman who had everything taken from her. As I climbed the steps, I replayed the judge's expression from the day I lost custody, the pity mixed with uncertainty, the sense that something hadn't added up despite the ruling. Today there would be no uncertainty. Today I would speak with the clarity I had been robbed of during the last trial. And this time I had the proof to back every word. Inside the courtroom, Jacob stood with his attorney, confident in that same arrogant posture that once fooled me into believing he was strong, dependable, trustworthy. But when his eyes met mine, something flickered, confusion, maybe even a flash of fear. He wasn't expecting me to look this composed. He wasn't expecting me to walk with such quiet strength. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering something, and Jacob nodded stiffly. I sat down, organizing my documents, pretending not to notice how his gaze kept drifting to the folder in my hands. He didn't know what was inside, but he could sense it was something he hadn't prepared for. When the judge entered, the room shifted. The air became heavier, more serious, more deliberate. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, but I kept my chin lifted. After the introductions and procedural formalities, my attorney began laying out the facts. Careful, steady, structured. But the moment that truly changed the atmosphere was when we presented the first document from my grandfather's chest. A notarized transfer of ownership dated years before Jacob ever entered my life. The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. Jacob's attorney objected, muttering about relevance, but the judge allowed it. That was the first crack in Jacob's carefully constructed narrative. We continued, piece by piece, building the foundation my grandfather had unintentionally left behind for me. Letters, receipts, amendments, even photographs showing my grandfather on the estate long before Jacob's family ever claimed connection to it. With each item presented, Jacob grew more visibly tense. His jaw tightened, his foot tapped restlessly against the floor, and every so often he shot his attorney a look that practically screamed, "Fix this." But there was no fixing it. Not when the truth was unfolding in front of everyone like a tapestry I had finally learned how to read. When Jacob's turn to respond finally came, his voice lacked the confidence he once wielded so effortlessly. He avoided my eyes, focusing instead on rehearsed lines his attorney had clearly drilled into him. He claimed misunderstandings, miscommunications, family lore about inheritances that had become unclear with time. But the judge wasn't buying it, not when the evidence contradicted every word spilling from his mouth. And then came the moment that silenced the entire room, the recording device from my grandfather's chest. I had transferred the audio to a format the court could play, and when his voice, steady, clear, unmistakably deliberate, filled the room, the truth became undeniable. The recording revealed conversations my grandfather had with a family friend, discussing his concerns that someone might one day challenge my right to the estate. He stated explicitly that the property belonged to him alone and that he had personally chosen me as its sole heir. As his voice echoed through the courtroom, I felt a sting behind my eyes, not of sadness but of profound gratitude. My grandfather had protected me long before I understood I would need protecting. And as I looked at Jacob, I saw the exact moment he realized he had lost. His shoulders sagged, his expression hollowed, and for once he had no words. Just when I thought the hearing couldn't get more emotional, the judge turned his attention to the part of the case I feared the most: my children. He reviewed the previous ruling, examining the testimony Jacob used to paint me as unstable, irresponsible, and unfit to raise them. But this time, we countered with evidence: proof of altered documents, inconsistencies in Jacob's claims, and even a witness who came forward after learning the truth from the documents I discovered. The judge's stern expression softened slightly when he looked at me, and I felt a single fragile thread of hope wrap itself around my heart. The hearing stretched into hours, but every second mattered. By the end, the judge leaned back, his fingers steepled, his gaze shifting between Jacob and me as though weighing not just facts, but intentions, integrity, and character. When he finally cleared his throat to speak, the room went silent. His words came slowly, measured, but each one struck me with the force of 1,000 emotions. He acknowledged the overwhelming evidence proving the estate was rightfully mine. He acknowledged that I had been misled, manipulated, and unfairly judged. And then he said the words that made my breath hitch: the custody ruling would be reviewed immediately. A wave of relief crashed over me, but I held myself steady, refusing to let the moment sweep me away before it was officially complete. The judge announced that pending final review, my children would be returned to me temporarily, under my care, until a full reassessment of the custody arrangement could be completed. Jacob's face contorted, anger, disbelief, panic all swirling together. But he stayed silent, understanding that any outburst would only worsen his standing. I felt tears slide down my cheeks, not with weakness, but with the overwhelming realization that the nightmare I had lived through was finally beginning to unravel. When court adjourned, I gathered my documents with trembling hands, holding them close to my chest. As I walked toward the exit, Jacob approached me, but I didn't slow down. His voice was low, almost desperate, as he muttered something about things not being over, about misunderstandings and miscommunication. But I didn't bother turning toward him. For the first time in a long time, his words had no power over me. I stepped outside into the warm afternoon air, and as the sunlight washed over me, I realized something profound. I wasn't the same woman who had walked into this courthouse the first time. I was stronger. I was wiser. And I was finally free from his shadow. As I stood at the top of the courthouse steps, looking out at the busy street below, a calmness settled over me. The battle wasn't fully over, not yet. But for the first time since this nightmare began, the path ahead was no longer wrapped in darkness. It was clear, illuminated by the truth I had fought so hard to reclaim. My children would soon be in my arms again. My home, my dignity, my name, all of it was rising from the ashes of lies and deceit. And with every breath I took, I felt the strength of my grandfather's quiet, guiding presence. The fight for justice had only just begun, but I was ready for whatever came next. The day I was told I could bring my children home, even temporarily, felt like stepping into a dream I had once buried to protect myself from disappointment. I drove to the Child Services office with my hands cold against the steering wheel, my heart thumping in uneven rhythms that echoed every emotion I had carried since the day they were taken from me. As I walked inside, the room seemed brighter than I remembered, or maybe I was the one who had changed. I stood there waiting, breathing slowly, feeling that mixture of fear and hope swirling inside me like a storm preparing to settle. And then the door opened and everything inside me shifted. My children stepped out quietly, unsure at first, almost cautious, as though afraid that coming to me might shatter an illusion. They had grown in the short time we were apart. My son taller, my daughter's face a little more serious. But when their eyes met mine, something inside them recognized me instantly, and they ran forward with a speed that turned my breath into a sob. I knelt, catching both of them against me, feeling their little arms wrap around my neck in a way that made every sleepless night, every tear, every moment of doubt worth surviving. In that embrace, my heart remembered how to beat without pain. Driving home with them in the backseat was surreal. They talked in bursts. Stories from school, little complaints, tiny secrets whispered to make sure I didn't forget I was still their safe place. I listened to every word, savoring their voices, the small sounds of their laughter, even the sibling bickering that I had once found exhausting. When we reached my temporary apartment, they walked inside curiously, studying every corner as if trying to understand the life I had been forced to build without them. I told them gently that this place wasn't permanent, that our real home might soon be coming back to us. Their eyes brightened with hope and I felt a warmth fill the room. Over the next few days I kept preparing for the final court session, the one that would decide everything for good. But for the first time, preparation didn't feel like a desperate attempt to outrun failure. It felt like stepping into the life my grandfather always believed I deserved. My children's laughter followed me around the apartment while I organized documents, rehearsed explanations and double-checked every detail. Sometimes I would pause just to watch them play, reminding myself that the fight was no longer just about reclaiming a mansion. It was about returning them to the life they were meant to have, free from manipulation and lies. The morning of the final hearing arrived sooner than I expected. My attorney met me outside the courthouse, offering a reassuring smile that steadied my nerves. Inside, Jacob sat with a stiffness that bordered on panic. His once confident posture had collapsed into something uncertain, as though he finally understood that the truth he had tried so hard to bury had risen stronger than he ever expected. The judge reviewed the remaining documents, the official verification of my grandfather's signatures, and the testimony from the witness who confirmed Jacob's involvement in altering evidence. Every word brought me closer to the justice I had been denied for far too long. When the judge finally spoke, the room fell silent in a way that made every heartbeat feel amplified. His ruling was clear, firm, and impossible to misinterpret. The estate, my grandfather's estate, was legally and irrevocably mine. The previous custodial decision was overturned, fully restoring my parental rights and granting me primary custody of my children. Jacob's actions were condemned, his manipulation acknowledged, and his attempt to seize what was never his formally recorded as intentional misconduct. I didn't cry, not at first. I simply sat there absorbing every syllable, letting the truth settle into the places where grief once lived. It wasn't until I stepped outside, breathing the cool air, that the tears finally came, not out of sorrow but out of release. My children ran to me, their small hands grabbing mine eagerly, and I held them with a strength I didn't know I still possessed. We drove to the estate together, this time not as visitors or intruders, but as its rightful owners. The gates opened slowly, creaking in a welcoming kind of way, as though the house itself had been waiting for us to return. Standing in front of it again, I felt history settling back into place like a wound finally closing. The mansion was exactly as I remembered, grand, familiar, filled with quiet echoes of my childhood memories. My children explored every hallway, every room, laughing so loudly that the house seemed to come alive again. I walked through slowly, touching the banisters, the frames, the walls that had once held my happiest memories. And as I moved from room to room, I realized that the home wasn't just a structure. It was a legacy, a promise, a testament to my grandfather's faith in me. I whispered a quiet thank you into the air, hoping that somewhere in some quiet corner of eternity he heard me. The following weeks felt like a soft sunrise. Slow, gentle, warm. We rebuilt our routines, our joy, and our sense of safety. My children grew comfortable again, running through the garden, painting in the sunroom, sleeping in the rooms they once feared they would never see again. And I rebuilt myself too. Not into the woman I was before the betrayal, but into someone stronger, sharper, and far more aware of her own worth. I learned that losing everything wasn't the end. It was the beginning of understanding just how much strength lived inside me all along. One evening, as I tucked my children into bed, my daughter asked softly, "Mom, are we safe now?" Her voice trembled just a little and I felt my heart pull tight with emotion. I sat beside her and brushed her hair gently, telling her the truth. Yes, we were safe and we would stay safe because truth had finally won. They both smiled sleepily, holding my hands until their eyes closed. Standing there watching them breathe, I realized that victory wasn't the court ruling or the estate or the legal justice. It was the peace returning to their small, fragile hearts. Late that night, I walked outside and stood beneath the stars, letting the cool wind brush against my skin. Everything that had once felt impossible was now behind me. The lies had been exposed, the wounds had begun healing, and the legacy my grandfather left me had finally settled where it belonged. I took a deep breath, allowing the quiet night to wrap around me. I wasn't just restored, I was transformed. And in that silence, I understood that even when the world tries to break you, truth has a way of rising, powerful and undeniable. If you're listening to my story now, standing at your own crossroads, wondering whether the truth still matters or whether the fight is worth the exhaustion, let my journey be your reminder. You rise when you refuse to give up. You win when you choose courage over silence. And even when everything seems against you, even when the world doubts your strength, there is always a way forward if you're willing to fight for it. So keep going. Keep pushing. And when your moment comes, don't hesitate. Claim your truth, claim your power, and rise again.